Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar, Scaling Cleaner Actions through Hyperlocal Air Quality Monitoring, Lessons Learned and Recommendations. My name is Sergio Sanchez, and I will serve as today's moderator. First of all, before we begin, some quick housekeeping announcements. Simultaneous translation is available for this event. Look at the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At the right end, you will find an icon with an air globe. Click on this icon and choose the option that better fits you. Translation off if you don't need any translation at all, Spanish translation or English translation. So to start, let me tell you that today's webinar has been organized as a panel dialogue guided by predefined key strategic questions. We have invited to this dialogue a set of distinguished experts and officials from cities that have recently been making significant progress to harness the power of hyperlocal air quality monitoring to catalyze effective cleaner actions. A recording of this presentation will be available after the webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions and comments you have during the presentation directly into the chat box on the webinar control panel. We will try to answer as many as possible. And now I am delighted to introduce our first speakers this morning who will deliver their opening remarks for this webinar. First, let me introduce Sarah Vogel, Vice President of Health with Environmental Defense Fund. Also, Dr. Victor Hugo Paramo, Executive Coordinator, Megalopolis Commission for the Environment in Mexico. And on behalf of Marina Robles, Secretary of the Environment for the Mexico City government, we have Sergio Cirat Hernandez, Director General for Air Quality Management. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. I turn over to you.
Thank you, Sergio. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone here today. My name is Sarah Vogel. I'm the Vice President of the Health Program at the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF. We're really looking forward to today's discussion and this webinar, and I want to thank you all for joining us, for taking time out of what we know are really busy schedules, and for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and your inputs today. As Sergio noted, we're joined by just an extraordinary group of experts from around the world, from Glasgow, London, Los Angeles, and Medellin, to share with us their experiences using innovative sensing technology to really strengthen air quality monitoring and scale effective clean air actions. And we've also really have welcomed them to share with us their recommendations for Mexico City and other urban areas around the world that are interested in making a step forward in this direction. This webinar is not a standalone event, but is part of a new collaborative project in Mexico City. So last September, Mexico City government, the Environmental Commission of the Megalopolis, the government of the state of Mexico, the National Institute for Ecology and Climate Change, the Federal Secretariat for the Environment and Natural Resources, and Environmental Defense Fund initiated this new collaborative project to design a sound methodology for a proof of concept hyperlocal monitoring system for the Mexican capital. Just briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with my organization, EDF, we are a science-based, nonpartisan advocacy organization with a global presence focused on cutting pollution to protect public health, to stabilize the climate, and working to support healthy and climate-resilient ecosystems and the ocean. Our approach is really to focus on the most critical environmental challenges facing people on the planet, by combining science, economics, law, and really powerful partnerships, which I think we have on display today. EDF's Global Clean Air Initiative has been working for many years to really harness or unlock the power of new and existing technologies to understand air pollution at this more highly localized level within cities or across large urban landscapes, where more and more of the world people, of course, are living, working, and playing. And we've been doing this to better understand the distribution, the sources, and really the health, the economic health and climate impacts of that air pollution to inform and both inspire really targeted solutions to clean air. We know from this work that air pollution is not distributed evenly across these urban landscapes, and that the impacts on health of the population are often unequitable. So we feel that measuring and mapping air pollution at this hyperlocal scale can provide really critical information that can be used really by a diversity of stakeholders, from community groups advocating for cleaner air to air pollution managers, urban planners, transportation planners, industry, again, to prioritize target solutions and the resources to cleaner air. So this joint project in Mexico is working to take advantage of these state-of-the-art technologies, analytical tools, and expertise in the field. And it's also aiming to incorporate best practices and lessons learned around the world. And that's why we've convened today's webinar, to really hear directly from cities working on these efforts, to learn from them about what's working, what have been critical components to successfully deploying really effective and useful air monitoring networks, and ensuring the sustainability and utility of that information in catalyzing clean air action. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now, Dr. Páramo, I turn it over to you.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, estimada Sara Vogel, Sergio Cirat, Sergio, amigos de muchos años y distinguidos ponentes de este seminario. Mi nombre es Víctor Hugo Páramo y soy el coordinador ejecutivo de la Comisión Ambiental de la Megalopolis, que la conocemos como CAME. CAME es una organización de coordinación de acciones ambientales entre el gobierno federal y los gobiernos de la Ciudad de México y de los estados de México, Hidalgo, Morelos, Puebla, Querétaro y Tlaxcala, que constituyen en la región centro del país. En la CAME tenemos grupos de trabajo y entre ellos tenemos el grupo de monitoreo de calidad del aire, cuyo objetivo principal es mejorar y actualizar los instrumentos de medición, así como armonizar las técnicas y las prácticas de los técnicos de cada entidad de la megalópolis. Todo ello pues para asegurar que la información de la calidad del aire es homogénea y es confiable. Estamos nosotros participando en este proyecto interesantísimo de metodología de monitoreo de alta resolución porque estamos convencidos de que puede ser un complemento muy interesante para el monitoreo ambiental que se hace con los sistemas de monitoreo atmosféricos de las ciudades de la megalópolis. Como sabemos, el monitoreo ambiental tradicional es empleado pues, para contar con información para compararse, por ejemplo, con las normas o estándares de protección de la salud de las poblaciones. Este monitoreo tradicional sabemos también que es de muy alto costo y se requiere de personal altamente especializado para llevarlo a cabo. Este monitoreo también permite identificar las fuentes de emisión de los contaminantes del aire. En muchas ocasiones este monitoreo tradicional se ha empleado para evaluar la exposición personal de los contaminantes del aire, siendo que en general, como sabemos, las estaciones de monitoreo pues, se encuentran lejos de las personas. Por otra parte, pues sabemos también que están emergiendo estos nuevos métodos complementarios para medir la calidad del aire, como son los sensores de bajo costo y la información satelital, que son muy prometedores. Por supuesto, estos nuevos métodos todavía requieren de los instrumentos tradicionales de alto costo para ser calibrados, pero lo interesantísimo de estos nuevos métodos es que permiten ver lo que ocurre en el sitio donde se encuentran las personas, lo cual los hace súper interesantes, ya que nos permiten proporcionar medidas de protección de la salud al momento para las personas, donde se encuentra la persona. Asimismo, pues al ser más barato nos permite pues, desplegar y tener esta información muy puntual en amplios territorios y por lo tanto podemos también identificar lo que conocemos como los hotspots de emisiones de contaminantes. Entonces, como pueden ver, pues es súper interesante para la gestión de la calidad del aire en una ciudad, y en este caso nosotros lo vemos a la escala de la megalópolis del centro de México. En fin, hay muchos temas interesantes a explorar, y de ahí nuestro interés de escuchar a las y los expertos invitados en este seminario. Finalmente, queremos decir que estamos muy agradecidos con la Ciudad de México y EDF por invitarnos a participar en este interesantísimo proyecto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Páramo. And then Sergio Sirat Hernández, I turn it over to you.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. A nombre de la doctora Marina Robles, secretaria de Medio Ambiente de la Ciudad de México, me da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida a este webinar que forma parte de la implementación de un proyecto que deriva de un esfuerzo conjunto entre el Gobierno de la Ciudad de México y el Environmental Defense Fund, en colaboración, por supuesto, con la Comisión Ambiental de la Megalopolis y otras instituciones. El proyecto tiene el objetivo de conocer, aplicar y evaluar nuevas tecnologías de medición de contaminantes del aire, como son los sensores de bajo costo, para complementar y fortalecer el monitoreo de la calidad del aire en la zona metropolitana del Valle de México. Con ello, estamos buscando generar datos que permitan, entre otras cosas, caracterizar la calidad del aire de entornos específicos como lo son escuelas, parques o centros deportivos, identificar zonas con alta contaminación en la ciudad, identificar fuentes locales de emisión con un alto impacto en la calidad del aire de su entorno, así como generar un diagnóstico más detallado sobre el impacto de la contaminación del aire en la salud de la población y, por supuesto, mejorar la comunicación sobre la calidad del aire hacia la población. Todo lo anterior tiene la finalidad de diseñar e implementar acciones para prevenir y controlar emisiones de fuentes locales en colonias, dirigidas a mejorar su calidad del aire, además de ser más eficientes en la comunicación con la población para que se logre una participación más activa, tanto en la realización de acciones personales que colaboren a reducir su tasa de emisión de contaminantes, como para garantizar una reacción más oportuna respecto a evitar exponerse al aire contaminado cuando éste se presente en su localidad. Agradezco enormemente el apoyo de las ciudades de Los Ángeles, Medellín, Londres y Glasgow, quienes hoy nos compartirán su experiencia con relación al monitoreo de calidad del aire de alta resolución que llevan a cabo en sus ciudades, lo que fortalecerá, sin lugar a dudas, la base metodológica del diseño y posible implementación de una red en la Ciudad de México. Muchas gracias a todos por su presencia, a Environmental Defense Fund por su apoyo y a nuestros invitados por compartir sus valiosas experiencias.
Thank you so much, Sergio, Sarah, and Dr. Páramo for providing us with these opening remarks that give us the context, the motivations, and the kind of experience that we are going to share along this webinar. And now, let me share my screen again, please. This is again a reminder for those who have just joined us that we have a simultaneous translation available. Please look at the slide. At the Zoom toolbar, you will find an icon with a planet Earth, and click on it and you will see translation off if you don't need translation, or Spanish translation or English translation. And now we are ready to start with our panel today. I am delighted to introduce our panelist, Irene Burga, Air Quality Advisor for the Office of the Mayor in Los Angeles City. Welcome, Irene. Elliot Treharne, who is the head of Air Quality of the Great London Authority. My friend Carlos Hoyos from the National University of Colombia in Medellin, and Universidad EAFIT, also in Medellin, Colombia. And Dom Callahan, Air Quality Specialist, Glasgow City Council. Thank you to all of you for sharing with us your knowledge, experience, and good practices about this issue in your cities. As mentioned, this webinar is organized as a panel discussion based on a set of predefined key strategic questions that have been formulated by the core group that is managing our project in Mexico City. And these questions are the ones that are going to help us to achieve the objective of this webinar. Our aim here, rather than a rigid structure, is to get a very dynamic conversation, shining a spotlight on key issues, lessons learned, and recommendations on hyperlocal air quality monitoring and its relevance to improve air quality in cities. I'm going to give you the guiding questions, and let me start by asking, each of your cities have a well-established network of air pollution reference monitors. So what does your city see as the benefits of adding a lower cost monitoring network? And let me start with London. You have such a wonderful network of reference monitors. What does London see as benefits of adding a lower cost monitoring network? Elliot, please, and thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited about today's event, and hopefully I can share a little bit of insight about what's been happening in London. So you're right, we've had a relatively large reference quality monitoring network since about 1995. We started to develop it. We've had about 100 monitoring stations across the city. And yet we knew that we wanted to have more of a kind of a localized understanding of air pollution, partly so we can build the case. What we have really discovered is we learned through our existing network the power of data to kind of build the case, to make people understand the impact that air pollution has. And the more disaggregated the information that you have, the stronger the case you can make, the more relevant a case you can make to an individual. It's about their home, it's about their school, it's about where they go to work or the park that they exercise in. It's also been practically incredibly powerful and useful because it's given us an extra tool to identify the kind of the areas where we need to take action. And also, and I think Sarah was talking about this earlier, and I think it's an incredibly powerful point, that's very much linked to being able to take the right kind of action to tackle the inherent social injustice, which is often the telltale mark of air pollution. And what we also wanted to be able to do, and I think it was, this is a very positive thing linked to that, is we wanted to increase the specific monitoring we could do at very sensitive locations where the population of those sites we knew would actually have the worst impacts from air pollution. So it's schools and hospitals. And practically, and we'll probably come onto this a bit later on, but there is, in terms of as a policy tool, in terms of us understanding a problem and enabling us to take further action, it's the new network that we've done through Breathe London has been invaluable in terms of enabling us to take further action, for example, at bus garages, where we didn't even realize that there was an emissions problem. And we only managed to understand that because we had the monitoring network. So all in all, additional monitoring at many more locations just improves our ability to communicate, to explain, to understand, and to take action against air pollution. Oh, you might be muted, Sergio.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Elliot. And let me follow up with Los Angeles. Irene, you have more than 50 years of experience with a comprehensive air quality monitoring and management approach in Los Angeles. What is the advantage you see for the actions you are taking on hyperlocal monitoring? Basically the same question, considering the long history that Los Angeles has.
Yeah, thank you, Sergio, and thank you for having me today here on this panel. So I think in Los Angeles, we've had a comprehensive history of regulatory monitoring because we've had to. Los Angeles has had terrible air quality. We have a history of extreme smog days, extreme ozone days, dating back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and really 70s until national and federal legislation around the Clean Air Act was passed, and California started to change regulations specifically tackling emissions from vehicles. And so really our comprehensive tracking of air quality started then. And, you know, I'm happy to say, and I think California is often referenced as a beacon for how to improve air quality in many ways, especially looking at transportation emissions. In Los Angeles, we were able to reduce smog by about 90% compared to how it used to be. And yet what we have found is that LA still ranks as having some of the worst air quality in the United States, and ozone pollution still out of compliance for national standards. And so the regulatory reference stations in Los Angeles that we have, which are about 4 for a city of 4 million, really are around looking at the regional air quality and seeing if we are in compliance with federal standards. But what we found as the city, in the city of Los Angeles, is that we were lacking hyperlocal data. So I think echoing what Sarah's remarks were, what Elliot just spoke to, lacking really data at an exposure level of what people are breathing and in specific communities and areas. In Los Angeles, we have a lot of different sources of pollution. We have a major port, we have an airport, we have a lot of traffic and passenger vehicles, refineries, oil and gas and industry. And we also have a lot of people, 4 million people. It's very dense. There's a lot of schools, there's a lot of parks. And so what we started to really hear was actually a lot of this was community driven too, that people wanted to better understand what was happening in their specific community, in their specific neighborhoods. And so when Mayor Garcetti launched his Green New Deal in 2019, and followed it up with an executive directive 25 in 2020, there was really a focus on community monitoring there. And there was a recognition that while the reference stations are great for understanding whether we're in compliance with federal mandates on air quality, that you know, we wanted to better understand at a community level what was going on. And so something that I can talk to more about today are, you know, we started to look at small pilots and deploying pilots, and specifically in communities that demanded it. And a lot of these communities were areas where there were gaps in air quality. So looking at, you know, low-cost sensor networks like Purple Air and other networks, we could see that there was, and the reference stations, of course, we could see that there was a gap in certain communities. And so we've launched 2 pilots. One is in the community of Watts, which is a historically disadvantaged community. And this was something we heard from them. And they said, we want more data and we want to understand what's happening at an exposure level. And so really the focus there is around deploying sensors in schools, near parks, and areas of concern where people are breathing, senior centers as well. And so I'll stop there because I know this is just a short intro, but I'd say that's really been the focus, is to complement our reference stations with community air monitoring at a hyperlocal level.
Thank you so much, Irene. And then let me follow with Dom. Dom, we are aware of the efforts Glasgow is doing through the Global Environmental Measurement and Monitoring Initiative. So following the same idea, what are you intending to do with the approach of hyperlocal monitoring in the context of Glasgow?
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this today. As a city which is just beginning to explore low-cost sensors in a network capacity, I'm hoping to learn quite a lot from the other panelists here today as well. In terms of Glasgow, Glasgow is by far the smallest of the cities represented here today. And as such, Glasgow is in a relatively good position when it comes to our air quality. We benefit from the prevailing winds bringing in relatively clean air from the Atlantic for much of the year. And this does affect the way that we monitor and address our air quality problems. We've currently got a network of 12 monitoring stations using reference equipment to monitor NO2 and particulate matter. But this is supplemented by a network of over 100 NO2 diffusion tubes. And effectively, those diffusion tubes are our low-cost network at the current time. The main advantage, in my opinion, of a low-cost network of automatic analyzers is the increased temporal data that becomes available. It allows you to see the diurnal trends and seasonal changes And it also allows you to quickly identify equality impacts caused by changes in local circumstances, such as road or traffic changes. However, in Glasgow, we currently meet all of the short-term air quality targets. So the value of a low-cost network in terms of a local air quality management process is more limited, and diffusion tubes tend to give us the spatial distribution evidence that we need. But that's not to say that we discount the use of these monitors. In the past, they've mostly been used for short-term monitoring around areas where we have specific air quality complaints relating to things such as idling around taxi ranks, for example. But we've also used them to conduct before and after studies around school buildings as part of our Car-Free Schools programme, which sees vehicles banned from the streets around some of our school buildings during drop-off and pick-up times. But so far, we haven't established a network of these low-cost monitors as such. However, as you mentioned, we're taking part in the GEM, Global Environmental Monitoring Study, which is looking to place low-cost monitors, a network of these around 25 of the schools within our city. And although it's primarily focused on carbon, we hope to get valuable information in terms of local air quality management pollutants from this as well.
Thank you so much, Dom. And let me ask Carlos Hoyos from Medellin. Also in Medellin, there is one of the best air quality monitoring networks in Latin America, with a long tradition of university involvement. I know you have been having these two roles with the city and the metropolitan area and with the university. What was your purpose in putting together this project with sensing technologies and citizens to monitor air quality and complement a reference grade network?
Well, first, let me thank you, Sergio, for inviting me to talk today here about our experience. To be honest, the original goal was education. As you were mentioning, from the university, we work with the environmental authority in a risk management project. So we run the early warning system in the city. And in 2015, we started to consider that we needed to treat and to think of air quality as a risk management issue, also tied to the local meteorology. We are in a deep valley, a narrow valley, and meteorology has a lot to do with our air quality critical episodes. So we decided to try to involve the community, because we needed to reach the community, engage the community to talk about these risk management issues, including air quality. So we launched a campaign through social networks and things like that for the community to adopt a sensor. Our sensor is in shape of a cloud, so we started talking to the people and asking who wanted to adopt a cloud. And the idea was that we built ourselves the sensors. We calibrated each and every sensor, and we installed this in the first phase. We installed 100 sensors in the houses of different families around the city, and we have an app that gives the people the information in real time, and with that we started working in workshops and talk to people and exchange experiences, their experiences. They were in charge of explaining the processes that they thought were making the air quality in their houses change, in their neighborhoods change, and from that it started to grow, because then in 2016 we had the worst air quality episode in the city, in the region. So the Citizen Science Network gained a lot of visibility because of that, and was used in many other ways, not only in educational purposes, but it has been immensely used and incredibly helpful for the city, for us to understand the role not only of emissions from the city, but also larger scale transport, biomass burning in the country, how it affects the air quality in our region. So I guess we can talk in more detail about that during the conversation, but it started as an educational project, but now it has been helpful for taking decisions in real time.
Thank you. That's fascinating, Carlos. Thank you so much. And let me move to the next question about applications. I would like to ask you, and please don't be shy, please try to give us a detailed picture on how your city is using hyperlocal monitoring so far to design, implement, and evaluate clean air solutions, including, as Carlos has mentioned, these contingency episodes and alert days that affect many cities. And let's start with Elliot, please.
So in terms of how we use the network, and perhaps be a little bit useful for me just to talk a little bit, and I didn't cover this in my introduction, about what the network actually looks like and about how some of the functionality has been useful to us in terms of actually designing the action that we've taken, and also crucially raising awareness, which is something that's very important side benefit of the network. So as I explained, we already have about 150 monitoring, reference quality monitoring stations in the city. What we were able to do with Breathe London, which is our expanded network, is we were able to introduce 100 additional cheaper sensors, which were AQ meshes. We were able to work with a number of schools to use their children to basically be scientists, to wear backpacks which had air quality monitoring equipment in it, so that we could better understand their exposure as they walked to and from school. And we also partnered with Google, who then use their Google Street View cars, which take measurements, which takes the pictures of for Street View. And we use those vehicles to actually take measurements as they were driving along about every 30 meters to kind of get a better understanding of the spatial spread of pollution across the city. So by using that information, we actually got a very rich data set, which enabled us to understand and to see issues which we hadn't previously seen or fully understood. So I think I mentioned in my previous example around bus garages. And although we knew that, bus garages had a high number of buses going in and out of them, what was really interesting is that we had located one of our new monitoring pods as part of Breathe London next to an entrance to one of those garages, which was in a residential area and opposite a school. And what it found was that actually there were very high concentrations. It actually jumped to the top of our league table in terms of pollution levels in the city. And it demonstrated to us that there was a particular problem with bus engine idling while buses were waiting to go into the bus garage at the end of the day when you were trying to bring them in. And so what we were able to do is actually to adopt a policy, which we then rolled out to all 70 of our bus garages, which actually changed the way that when you have kind of the change between peak and interpeak kind of rollout of buses, the number of buses that would be entering into the bus garage and actually stagger them in such a way that would actually help reduce their emissions and improve air quality in the local area. So that's a practical demonstration of the value of the local monitoring. Another thing that we've been trying to do is we've done a huge amount of work at schools trying to reduce the exposure of children to air pollution and also taking action at those schools to reduce emissions. And as I say, working with Dyson, we managed to develop a new sensor which could be worn in a backpack, and that gave information about the exposure of children to and from schools. And then we were able to work with the school to actually work with those children to think about the routes that children were taking to schools to reduce their exposure. So again, a practical way of raising awareness, taking action, and actually getting an end outcome of reducing exposure to pollution for a particularly vulnerable group. The last bit, which I think is also really important in terms of how you can actually use the hyperlocal monitoring, is how you can better understand the characteristics of specific locations. In addition to our reference quality monitoring network, London's got a really strong tradition working with our academic partners, Imperial College and King's College London, in actual understanding air pollution through modelling. But modeling only takes you so far, as anyone who works with modeling and air quality knows. It's based on the quality of the inputs and also the design of the model to reflect the actual landscape that it's trying to understand and articulate in terms of what's happening in terms of air pollution. And what's been fascinating is that we've been able to use a number of monitors in a very small 1 kilometre square area. And that's been able to give us a much stronger understanding of the variations between different types of location. And that's informing our strategy as to how we actually tackle some of the air pollution hotspots. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. And let me ask the same question to Dom. Please give us some examples on how you are using Hyperlocal or how you are planning to use Hyperlocal monitoring data for your clean air solutions.
Yes, thank you, Sergio. As I mentioned before, we have used low-cost monitors in specific circumstances to evaluate the effectiveness of air quality interventions, such as our Car-Free Schools programme. And they've been really useful for us, and they have showed clear benefits for the periods where cars were excluded compared to previously. The benefits were really apparent in some schools, because the schools that we chose tended to be those where a large proportion of the pupils were dropped off to school by car. So the changes between the times when there was regular access from the cars to the times when they were excluded were really noticeable around the drop-off and pick-up times for pupils. However, these are circumstances where the low-cost monitors worked well for what we specifically wanted them to do. In these cases, we were less interested in the absolute pollution levels, but we were more interested in the trends and the changes that would be observed after we had made an intervention, such as excluding road traffic. We have also used low-cost monitors for mobile monitoring, where we worked with a company called Ricardo to monitor mobile monitor around Glasgow city centre. And we found that to be really useful in terms of helping us identify junctions and street canyons that had elevated pollution levels, which perhaps we hadn't really realised could potentially have been a problem before. So it helped us to target where we would do further monitoring in those specific cases. With the GEM project, we are still in very early days. We're just beginning to roll out the monitors for that, and we're hoping to get some really good and useful data from it. But I'm happy to speak about that probably in answer to some of the later questions.
Thank you so much, Dom. And Irene, same question, please.
Yeah, so right now, the pilots that we do have in the community monitoring pilots that we have, we are publishing the data, just making it public through our website and online. And so I think the education piece and the awareness piece is important. We're also sharing the data with the community in regular community meetings. But as far as specific, well, and I'll just say, and I think there's a lot of value in the education piece of it, especially as we're still learning how reliable this technology is. We're trying to figure out which sensors to use, which ones work, which don't. Because another thing that we have learned is that while they're called low-cost sensors, it actually takes a lot of effort to maintain them, to make sure that they're calibrated correctly, to clean and validate the data, and then interpret and communicate the data. So it's no small feat. And so we're still learning a lot from our pilots. But something that we do have planned and we're developing right now is an air quality monitoring plan that our Los Angeles Department of Transportation is carrying out along with our Bureau of Street Lighting. And the idea there is to find partners to deploy sensors in our city streetlights, since our streetlights have power in them and we can plug in the sensors, and we can also use them, to place the sensors about 15 feet up around where the exposure level is of where people breathe, but far enough away from theft. But the idea is that we deploy these sensors for specific interventions that remove cars from the road. So Los Angeles is a signatory of the C40 Fossil Fuel Streets Declaration. And so we are planning on deploying a zero emission area in the city, one or maybe a couple of them. So that would be an area that, you know, we're removing cars from the road, we're creating pedestrian areas, active transportation areas. And so we predict that that will have a bigger impact on air quality. So we want to be able to use this technology and take advantage of these low-cost sensors to actually understand and track the progress of air quality with these actions. And this is a first thing for Los Angeles. Our Department of Transportation has never done anything like this, so it'll be a first project. But I think that's an exciting way that we're hoping to use these low-cost sensors. And I think there will be a lot of lessons to be learned. There's concerns about whether, you know, we will be able to use monitoring data for a specific area when there's so many pollution coming in from outside of the area. So how do you make sure you isolate, you know, that intervention specifically? So there's still a lot of question marks, but that is something that we're planning to do here.
Thank you, Irene. And Carlos, Medellin has a comprehensive air quality management plan. What is the role of sensing technologies in this plan, and particularly in the solutions that the city is looking for reducing air pollution?
Sure, Sergio, and it goes beyond the air quality issue now. Let me give you a couple of examples. But first, let me tell you what the sensors measure, because it's important. So now we started with 100 sensors, but now we have 300 sensors, 300 houses with sensors, and 100 bicycles with sensors now too. That's new this year, and it has been great. Well, last year now. The sensors measure PM 2.5. We have 2 different sensors of PM 2.5 in each station, and each low-cost station. We have temperature, humidity, atmospheric humidity, and we also have now noise levels, because that's a big issue here too. So with the data, there has been long-term decisions taken now, because we have the temperature as well. We have been able to evaluate the impact of local architecture and the urban tree, the impact of the urban tree in the heat regulation, right? So the environmental authority is prioritizing the areas that where the urban heat island is stronger, the effect of the urban heat island is stronger, to design the planting of the urban tree in a better way. That's from the point of view of the long-term planning, which is also tied to the air quality issue in a way. Now, directly related to air quality, we have been able to identify, for example, irregular activities with the low-cost network. For example, open pit mining that are using, well, probably the open pit mine itself is allowed to be there, but the processes that they're using are being irregular, or they are exploiting the mine in a rate that they are not allowed to. And we have been able to detect that with the local sensors, and then we communicate the environmental authority, and then after that they come with the regulatory equipment and verify the situation and take actions locally. We have been able to, for example, detect when we have a local biomass burning, a local wildfire, what's the area exactly that there is an impact. And so there's been actions taken, for example, in high schools or elderly homes, in terms of, for example, well, during today, you cannot have a physical activity because there's an impact in your area and things like that. I mentioned before that because of the shape of our valley, and even though we have a dense network, sometimes it's difficult to detect what's the actual cause of an increase in PM 2.5, for example. But now, last year, we had a lot of fires in the north part of the country and in Venezuela. And because of the direction of the winds, we were getting all that particulate matter towards our valley. And we started to notice that from the Citizen Science Network, because it was showing, well, first the increase was in the north, then started a few minutes later in the other town, and so on and so forth. So we were able to see from the Citizen Science Network the plume entering the city and accumulated inside of the valley. So that was huge too. So we could explain and show the community what was happening. And well, the decisions, of course, that the environmental authority takes is very different if we have to reduce the emissions from cars because we have like a PM2.5 concentration buildup, or if it's coming from outside. So we were able to inform the community and the environmental authority based on these low-cost network sensors as well. So now with the idea with the sensors in bikes is, well, our bike lanes are not extensive. We have a few kilometers of bike lanes, and the idea is to increase that. And we're going to use citizens are sharing as their location, their complete routes, and their quality along those routes. So the idea is to use that to design bike paths that are in regions of the city or in zones that have less pollution, or to lower the pollutions of those places that have that are used by cyclists more. We have, for example, the implementation of the swaps. We use the same name that they use in Spain, that are these low emission zones, basically, similar to that. And we are using the information from the bicycles to corroborate that and to track the changes of air quality in those places.
Thank you so much, guys. And we have a question about Irene has mentioned the reliability of sensors, that also is connected to the certainty or uncertainty of measurements. So since we are not just talking about measurements, but also public participation, policy design, decision-making, how do you deal with the uncertainties that are inherent to these technologies? And let me start with Irene.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we're currently working through these questions, specifically in our Watts Air Quality Community Monitoring Program. Yeah, I think it's really an important piece to all of this. Something that we try to do, that we're doing right now, is the process of co-locating a sensor with a reference station, so one that's validated, that has, that's government validated data. And so we have two sensors that are co-located at all times with these reference grid sensors. And we also calibrated all of our sensors that we deployed before with the reference grid station. But what we see now is, in our data analysis, we validate our data to see how closely correlated the data is with the reference station. So, the closer that our graph is to the data of the reference station, the better, the more validated that the data is, and the higher quality data that it is. But, I think something that we're also working on is around messaging of the low cost sensor data, because we aren't using it to say things like, there were 8 exceedance days of federal Clean Air Act standard attainment standards, for example. So we're not using this to talk in terms of air quality standards or saying anything about regulatory grade data. We're careful to message this around community awareness and education of, exposure level data, that it's one reference point, But if there's a spike in data, or if there's a spike in air pollution or something that we want to dig into more, then we would, work with our air pollution districts to really understand more what's going on there. If it's something that is an anomaly. But something that we've seen, for example, is with our low-cost sensor data, we saw a spike around, September and October of 2020. And that coincided with our wildfire season. We had terrible wildfires in Los Angeles and in Southern California and in Northern California too. And so that made sense to us and the data could be explained. But if we have some kind of anomaly, either something's going on with the sensor's, not working properly, or we have to consult with our regional air pollution district to understand what's going on. But I think it's all about, for us, the methodology is making sure that we always have a low-cost sensor in the reference station and that we're validating our data against the reference station. And then it's just also about how we communicate it. We don't say that this is regulatory grade data.
Excellent, thank you, Irene. Elliot, please.
So yeah, very, very similar. I think the accuracy of the network is a really important thing. And I think Irene said it very well at the end, that it comes to how you both present the data and use the data. This is not reference quality monitoring data. It's not meant to be that. It is not going to be an alternative for our statutory reporting, which remains very important. And we've made very clear that we want to maintain our existing reference quality monitoring network. But what it gives you is it gives you a very good understanding of what local air pollution is like. And it gives you that indicative sense about whether things are getting better or getting worse, about where is high and where is low. And I think that information is invaluable. And I think there is a wider point here that we need to think about much more than we have. And I think that these networks are way into how we make air quality data accessible. And part of the reason we were keen to partner with Google as part of Breathe London is because they bring an expertise in communicating data in an integrated way, so lots of data together through things like Google Maps, which I think is really, really valuable. Our experience is that despite having lots of great apps in London, it's quite a niche group of people who currently use them. So I think that there's a real challenge for us to make sure that people actually use the data as well as it being high quality data. And similarly, I think to Irene and their experience, we've done a lot of co-location of various monitoring pods with our reference quality monitoring network to try and make sure that we have as accurate and as comprehensive a set of monitoring data as possible.
Thank you, Elliot. Carlos, same question, please.
Yeah, basically, I agree with Irene and Elliot. We also collocate the sensors. And as I mentioned before, we include 2 different sensors in each monitoring station, just because of that, to be able to track also and to eliminate situations where one sensor could fail, for example, or give us a fake warning. And so we have the other sensors to track those issues. But we collocate the sensor at least for a month, each and every one. So I mentioned we had 300, so the 300 went through the same process, at least a month with a regulatory station. And we built sort of a calibration equation for each of the sensors. And our experience, talking about numbers here regarding PM 2.5, is that uncertainties about 2 micrograms per cubic meter in this regard. If you take that and you, even though we do the same, we don't necessarily communicate air quality categories with this, but if you were to do that, the uncertainty is about 2%, really. I mean, only 2% of the cases, you end up categorizing your air quality in a different category if you were to use those sensors. We also don't do that. We only communicate air quality categories with the regulatory stations, but it's useful to know that if you do calibrate or if you do construct calibration equations for each of the sensors, you get reliable information. Because there's a trend, and it's a little bit of a challenge that you can just buy a sensor, you know a little bit of electronics, in a couple of hours you have numbers. You don't really have to spend a lot of time to have numbers of air quality, but those numbers are not good. The variability of the local sensors from sensor to sensor, even if they are from the same batch, is very, very high. So you need to construct calibration equations for each and every sensor to be able to use them and take decisions with them.
Don, please, your opinion.
Hi, Sergio. I would echo what has already been said with regards to the low-cost sensor. I think you have to be really aware of the limitations in these low-cost monitors if you plan to use them. Especially, we wouldn't use them for measurements against the targets for compliance purposes at all. We would just use them for individual studies, mostly looking at the trends and changes. They are less accurate, they are subject to drift, and the results do become more reliable over time. So you have to really accompany this with robust pre and post installation checks. We do the same, as has been mentioned before. We have co-located the low-cost instruments with our reference stations, but I would echo what's just been said there. You find a lot of variability even between low-cost analyzers of the same type. So they have to be treated as individual instruments and adjusted accordingly. For example, our reference stations, they are subject to rigorous quality control on the data, and the ratification process is done in 3 to 6 month chunks. And even with that data, we have to be very careful about how we use that before it's been fully ratified. With low-cost monitors, you have to really be doubly careful. And for example, when you talk about diffusion tubes and nitrogen dioxide diffusion tubes, there's a long-established method of data quality control, including annual co-location studies and evaluation of the laboratory analysis. For low-cost monitors, I've seen various QC solutions proposed by individual instrument suppliers. You have to really evaluate what that proposed QC process is and have faith that they're going to give you the quality of the data that you're looking for.
Thank you so much. And now let's look forward. And the next question is, can you offer some insight into the next stage of your air quality hyperlocal monitoring networks? What will it involve and what are your goals? And are you incorporating climate considerations, as in the case of Glasgow? And perhaps we should start with Don this time.
Thanks, Sergio. Yes, Glasgow, I think by virtue of us hosting COP26, there's a lot of interest in Glasgow at the moment, and a lot of people looking to promote environmental projects within Glasgow and build on the success of COP. And we are more than happy to entertain those that seem to be of good value. And one of these is the GEM project. That's the Global Environmental Monitoring and Measurement Project. And that's a collaboration between the University of Strathclyde, Stanford University, Berkeley, the Optical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the Met Office in the UK, and the National Physical Laboratory. And the project basically involves working on a rollout of low-cost monitors housed in school buildings in Glasgow. And we're looking at a network of around 25 low-cost monitors, arranged as much as we can on a 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre grid to give us an overall spatial distribution across the city. And the hope is that this project will provide city leaders with real-time information, which would allow us to see the near immediate impact of policy decisions and help to measure progress against the city's target to become carbon neutral by 2030. And that really is the focus of this project. While the monitors will provide local air quality management pollutant sensors, The focus on this is really on the carbon dioxide monitoring. And current monitoring is conducted as part of the Council's statutory obligations in air quality and doesn't include carbon dioxide. The data that we have on carbon dioxide levels in the city are based on emissions inventories, and that's historic consumption of fuels for traffic power and so on. And those are only really made available 2 years in arrears. So it's hoped that this dense network of sensors will provide a more detailed picture of where atmospheric carbon dioxide is being produced at source and allow for more nuanced decision making on climate change policies. So we're also hoping that the additional monitoring that's undertaken in terms of the local air quality pollutants will help support the identification of specific sources of carbon dioxide. As well as the GEM project, we're also looking to expand low-cost sensor networks in terms of our low emission zone. Glasgow introduced a low emission zone for buses only at the end of 2018, but in 2023, that will be rolled out to cover all vehicles. And at the same time, we're also progressing with the Avenues project in the city, which removes a lot of road space from road traffic and reallocates it to sustainable transport. So we see low-cost sensors as being a good way of measuring the air quality impacts of both the low emission zone and the Avenues project.
Thank you, Dom. And let me ask Carlos the same question, considering the different purpose of the sensing network that he has described.
So the first part of the question, the current and the following challenge, I would say is the same, is the addition of these sensors that are going around installed on bicycles. That will provide a lot of information that will be very useful, and it's also a challenge in terms of data management and also privacy issues, because people want to share some part of the route, not all part of the route, and things like that. So that's a challenge in all the in different aspects, I would say. And regarding the climate aspect, so we do see the network, not isolated, but we do see the network and all the network of the early warning system as an important information to consider for climate considerations, and for also not only the global climate change, but also the urban tissue that is also important here in our area. We from the university helped the environmental authority building the climate change and climate variability action plan, and all this information is also based for the construction of this plan. And as I said before, our biggest issue probably in terms of air quality is PM 2.5, that is obviously tied to local emissions. So the same, basically the same actions that are included in this plan to target the PM 2.5 issue also target global climate change at the same time. And also risk management in a way, if you look in the longer term, because our biggest problem regarding climate change is the increase in frequency of extreme storms. So for our topographic conditions, we're in a deep valley, as I mentioned, so flash floods and landslides are a big issue for us. And we have seen in the last 20 years an increase in the frequency of extreme events associated to climate change. So all of this is tied together. The ecosystem also is part of this, and we cannot isolate and say, well, this network is useful by itself. No, it's the collective view of all the sensing equipment that we have, and also modeling. We have been able to improve our modeling, the dispersion modeling, for example, using the low-cost citizen science network.
Thank you, Carlos. And now, Irene, same question, please.
Yeah, I think there's a few different areas that we're looking to expand using low-cost sensors. One is one I already mentioned, which is looking to deploy sensors on our city street poles at specific transportation related interventions. So interventions that are removing cars from the road, specifically our zero emission area that we're planning to do. So I think understanding how to use low cost sensors and a combination with modeling to be able to understand what the benefits are of a zero emission area. So a lot to learn from the folks on this panel too around that. And then I think a couple of other areas, we are launching a program with our public libraries around citizen science and air quality. And they're launching a module just on the basics of air pollution and air quality. And they're also doing a program where you can check out a handheld air quality sensor. So you can check it out from the library, and they're doing some training on how to use the handheld sensor. So that program has been on hold because of COVID-19. Our libraries are closed right now, but that's another program that we're looking to use, and it's very much just around engagement and awareness using these handheld sensors. And then I think another area is a project that we currently have that's funded through NASA, and it's called Predicting What We Breathe. And this project looks to fuse satellite data with ground-based sensors, so with ground-based low-cost sensors and regulatory grade sensors, but using all of this data, fusing it together and getting a better picture of what the air quality, urban air quality patterns are in Los Angeles, and then being able to also develop machine learning algorithms to predict the air quality in the future. So that's a little bit more, obviously more technical and maybe academic in some ways, but the hope there is that we're able to use a combination of our ground-based low-cost sensors in combination with the satellite sensors to get a better picture of the air quality. So I think that's going to be a really interesting use case too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Renee. And now, Elliot, perhaps you want to tell us about the second phase of Breathe London.
Yeah, there's quite a few bits which are probably worth just touching on quickly. So I think the first bit, as you say, is fantastic. We've got a commitment using part of the City Hall budget, but also with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies to continue Breathe London into a second phase, which will hopefully mean a further opportunity to kind of test the concept of using cheaper sensors and using those at kind of those sensitive locations like schools and hospitals. So definitely more sensors and more locations is absolutely where we want to get to. But it's also something quite interesting as well in terms of more community involvement. And I think one of the things we're really excited about the new model that we have is that community groups will be able to buy in at relatively low cost, buy one of their own sensors through crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, pardon me, or whatever it might be, to then be able to include that in the monitoring network, but also identify the sites of concern to them. So we think that that could be a really nice kind of combination, which could see a really good collaboration going on between the formal monitoring network and more community-led interest. The climate point is a really interesting one, and I think that that is worth discussing. We often refer about the twin dangers in London, the twin dangers of air pollution and the climate emergency. And again, a lot of the policy action that we're taking now is we want to be much more integrated in terms of tackling both of them. And that includes using air pollution and using the Breathe London monitoring network to actually make the case for people to make the changes that we need, whether it's more walking and cycling, more public transport, using less polluting vehicles, to actually reduce both air pollutant emissions, but also climate emissions as well, and carbon emissions in particular. And then the jewel in the crown of what we've got going on this year is in October, we will be expanding our central London ultra low emission zone up to the north-south circular, which is a much larger area, basically the whole of inner London, where 3.8 million people live. And that is going to be a transformative scheme. And what we want to be able to do with the monitoring network, including Breathe London 2, is continue to monitor and explain and understand the impacts of that policy. Because in central London, we've seen around a 44% reduction in NO2 concentrations since around 2017. And that has been driven by these charging policies, which target more polluting vehicles. And we think that that is a really powerful intervention. And we think that hyperlocal monitoring will have a role to play in telling its success story.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elliot. And now let's move to a very important issue, which is sustainability, financial or resource sustainability. What are you planning to keep and eventually sustain these hyperlocal monitoring projects and networks in place? What are you doing basically to ensure their sustainability? Carlos, let's start with you.
Well, that is a very important issue, because you have to, if you are going to build this local network, you really need to consider the maintenance and in a long term. That's sort of a very basic issue, but sometimes it's not for decision makers. They often tend to forget that the investment goes beyond the value of the initial push for these networks. We have been able to keep it, as I said, because it's part of a large-scale monitoring network that includes weather radars and turbulence equipment to measure turbulent fluxes and CO2 fluxes, and weather stations, more than 100 weather stations in the city, and all that. So the cost of the low-cost air quality sensor is very low compared to the cost of the entire network and the air quality network. And we have been able to include it there. And that way we have been able to keep it going, because as I mentioned before, we started in 2015. And now we have more than 5 years with the network. And of course, with the help of the citizens. Without the citizens, without the families that are participating on this, we wouldn't be able to do it, because it's a lot of sensors. And what the families are doing for us is providing electricity. I mean, we install the sensors in their homes, so they do provide electricity, and they also provide the Wi-Fi, so we don't have to pay for real-time for the real-time communications of the data to our servers. So I will say that's key. Has been also key not only for the education, as I mentioned, but also to be able to maintain the network, citizens, and the fact that it's part of a larger network.
Thank you, Carlos. Irene, please. Same question.
Yeah, so I think 3 things come to mind: staffing, funding, and buy-in from decision makers. So I think with us and a lot of our projects, they're 2 to 3 year projects right now, because of how either they're funded usually, and the way that most of the funding that has come for our pilots and our project has come either from external organizations like our NASA funded project, or just extra money that we had in the city, which we don't have anymore because our budget is in a state of crisis with COVID-19. So I think looking to the future, really, I think in the immediate future, we're going to have to rely on partnerships quite a bit with academic partners and foundations, and really going out and looking for funding. The other challenge in Los Angeles is that we don't have an air quality department. So we don't have any one department that's in charge of air pollution. We have regional air pollution districts, and we have to work with them. But that can be often a challenge because as working in the mayor's office, we have a mandate around air quality, and we're trying to find a home for it in the city. And there's not always a clear home for it in a city department. So for example, Los Angeles Department of Transportation right now is working on an air quality monitoring plan to look at deploying sensors around transportation projects. But it takes a lot of, sometimes it takes a lot of, convincing and persuasion, and they need to understand what the benefit is, and is there a benefit? We're still trying to understand, what the challenges are around low cost sensors and what the limits are. And so it takes a lot of conversations, a lot of concern about staffing too, who's going to be able to staff. So I think for us in a city where we don't have an air pollution department, necessarily. We really do rely on academic partners and external funding. And right now, most of our projects are 2 to 3 years. But I think that's a really excellent point. If we're going to have, you know, a ubiquitous and sort of widespread air quality network, it's really going to take more funding and more buy-in from like a specific city department. And that's something that is a huge challenge for us and that we still haven't cracked the code on.
Thank you so much. Dom, and then Elliot, please. Same question.
Thanks, Sergio. Yes, as I mentioned, the GEM project is an externally funded project. Glasgow is a partner. We are supplying the buildings and helping with the locations of the sensors, but it is subject to that external funding. And it is predicted to be in place for a minimum of 2 years and evaluated before the end of this time. They're looking to give a preliminary presentation of results at an event to coincide with COP26, but obviously it will continue for a year and a half at least after that. But when using electrochemical sensors, you really have to factor in things like their expected lifespan and replacement costs. And for most of the sensors I've seen, 2 years seems to be around the usual time before you have to start looking at replacement. After that period of time, that's when you get into things such as ongoing budget allocations, which I don't think I need to tell anyone can be a bit of a minefield. But with regards to Glasgow City Council's own projects and funding, for example, the low-cost sensors that we plan to put out around the low emission zone and the Avenues project, those will be rolled into our existing budgets, and the funding will come from them. Again, they will be evaluated usually over a period of around 2 years before and after implementation of these interventions, and decisions will be made then on extension of them, the individual project, or whether we look to roll out the network further if we found it to be useful.
Thank you, Dom. Elliot, please.
Sorry, just had a problem with the, the unmuting. Yes, I think there's a couple of things that are probably worth reflecting on. One of the challenges that we had in London is that because we do have a good quality monitoring network, it is challenging to make the case, especially in the current context where budgets are getting even tighter. You know, everyone is dealing with COVID at the moment and, you know, the economic consequences of that. So we've been very lucky in London that we've had strong philanthropic support, both for the first round, which came from the Clean Air Fund and SIF, and the second round where, although we put in quite a considerable amount of money ourselves, that's also now been matched by Bloomberg. So it's definitely when you're doing something which is more innovative and which is you know, developmental, it's important, and it's a really positive thing about the air quality space at the moment. And EDF being involved, for example, is another demonstration of this. But it's really important that we do have these spaces and these organizations involved to help us kind of develop and trial these new approaches. In terms of sustainability, thanks to the pilot, which was externally funded through philanthropy, we've been able to make that case internally about why we should be putting about some of our own resources into this. And I think through that, we are putting this onto a long-term, more sustainable model. But this also comes down to part of the attraction of this approach, if we get it right, not just for London, but for other cities, is the affordability of it. And is the ability that it gives us to kind of, at relatively, you know, good value for money, to kind of roll out monitoring across a much larger area, which until a few years ago in the development of these sensors was out of reach. And I think the other aspect, which I think is really good around the sustainability point, is by getting community groups involved and people who have a particular concern about a location, whether it's a school or maybe it's a campaign, whatever it might be, to kind of invest in the technology itself. The kind of the delivery model that we are developing hopefully will also address some of those issues around sustainability.
Thank you, Elliot. We are running short of time. We have just 8 minutes left. And having in mind your expertise, I would like to summarize just in a couple of recommendations or whatever you want to make, what would you recommend Mexico City and other cities that are undertaking sensing technologies, hyperlocal, high resolution monitoring to set them for success? And let's start with Irene, please.
Yeah, my answer to this is sort of what my answer was to the previous question. I think the number one thing is just to make sure that you have staff that's dedicated to monitoring, that you have partnerships with organizations that can be dedicated to this work, and that an understanding that you will need staff and funding in order to install and maintain the sensors, to calibrate the sensors, to validate and cleanse the data, to analyze the data, to interpret the data and make sense of it. So it really is there's a lot of steps that go into it. And sometimes I think, and I'm repeating myself again, but the low cost sensors can actually be much higher cost than is originally envisioned. It's not just about purchasing the hardware or even just installing it if you're really going to make the data valuable and valid. And then from a technical standpoint, I think it's just some of the best practices include, if you're able to calibrate the data, with a reference type of station or reference grade type of station. There's also other unique calibration methods that are coming out, being able to calibrate a network with each other. And you also want to have your reference station to be somewhat close to the area where you're deploying all of the sensors, so that you're getting the reference station in that specific area too. But yeah, so I think my main advice and something that we're just grappling with is just to make sure that you have the staffing and dedicated funding needed to maintain these networks.
Thank you, Rene. Don, please.
Yes, Sergio, I would echo a lot of what Rene said there in terms of you could expect to have higher staff costs when it comes to a network of low-cost sensors, just because of the time-consuming factors that you have to take into account, such as the pre- and post-calibration and the data maintenance. I found that low-cost sensors are very useful in terms of education and promotion activities. If you target the locations of them and tie those in to certain groups, such as school pupils is a very good one, community action groups, those kind of people, you can get a lot of benefit from a low-cost sensor network through that approach. But I think it all really comes down to what Mexico City wants to achieve from the low-cost sensor network. Is it to show demonstration of regulatory compliance? If so, you have to be very aware of the limitations of the low-cost sensors. But if it is for a wider data gathering exercise to show trends, to promote education, to promote sustainability, then they're very useful from that. So I think you have to really identify what is your proposed use case for a low-cost sensor network and design it and integrate it appropriately with the limitations that these things have.
Thank you, Dom. Carlos, your summary recommendations, please.
Well, I'll adhere to those comments by Irene and Dom, but I would say, yes, do it. That would be my first recommendation. If you're going to do it, fund it and fund it well for at least 2 years. Involve the community. Our experiences with the Citizen Science Project has been great. Involve the universities. Involve immediately not only the universities to help design the project, but at least you have the opportunity to have like 5 master's theses helping this. You have one in communications, one in systems, and one in electronics. Of course, one in air quality, and you can have much more. So involve the universities immediately as well. And it's of course the costs are going to increase, but it's not a waste of money. It's an investment. So do it.
Thank you, Carlos. Finally, Elliot.
we're short of time, so I'm going to give a very pithy summary. So 3 key points to take away. More is more. You want lots of sensors. That is the advantage of this network. You want that kind of personal, relevant data, you know, of that person's school, you know, where you work, how you get to wherever you travel around. But obviously within that context, quality is still important. It doesn't need to be reference quality, but it does need to enable you to understand a trend, to understand if an area is better or worse, and to understand where the worst pollution is located. And finally, and this is a challenge to all of us, fantastic if we're developing these networks, but people need to use them. And when I say people, I don't just mean experts like us. It needs to be something that can be a valuable tool to reduce exposure, raise awareness, and help us make the case for improving air quality.
Thank you all for this wonderful conversation. And we certainly would like to keep in touch for the purposes, the objectives of the Global Clean Air Initiative, and in particular for this project in Mexico City. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, and also a huge recognition to all who have participated in the planning and organization of this webinar. I would like to remind everyone that a recording of this presentation will be made available on our website, globalcleanair.org. And that's all for today's webinar. We are going to keep in touch. And you are invited to sign up also for our EDF's new monthly Global Clean Air e-newsletter. And we will let you know what is the link you need to click in order to register. Thank you so much, so long, and hope to see you soon in another of our webinars and other events. Have a good day.